How does witnessing the death of one's teacher change a person? When a man dies by drinking poison, what does his student do? In the 5th century BC, there was a young man in Athens. He lost his teacher, and his life was never the same again. Tonight we will discover the story of Plato, the architect of Western philosophy, from the allegory of the cave to the ideal state. Before moving to our video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share in the comments which city you're following us from. Now let's begin the journey of a man who chased ideals. Plato was born in Athens in 428 BC. His real name was Aristocles, but everyone called him Plato. Plato meant broad-shouldered, because in his youth he practiced wrestling and had a strong body. He came from a wealthy, noble family. His mother, Perictione, was descended from Solon, the ancient lawgiver of Athens, and his father Ariston claimed to be descended from kings young. Plato had everything: money, education, and a bright future awaiting him. However, Athens was going through a complex period. At that time, the Peloponnesian War was continuing, and the city was in conflict with Sparta. When Plato was 10 years old, Pericles died, and with this event, the golden age of Athens was ending. The streets were becoming tense. People were worrying. As the war prolonged, losses were increasing, and unrest in society was growing. Nevertheless, wealthy families were relatively protected from this chaos, and thanks to this, Plato had the chance to receive a good education. In his youth, everything seemed beautiful. He was learning music, writing poetry, practicing wrestling, studying mathematics. He was especially passionate about theater, and had therefore begun writing tragedy plays. Moreover, he was planning to enter politics, because both his family and society expected this. Everything seemed ready for Plato. But then a man entered his life and changed everything. That man was Socrates. When he was around 20 years old, Plato began listening to Socrates. That old man was walking around the agora, asking people questions. At first, Plato had approached only out of curiosity. This man was really very strange, because he didn't charge money, wasn't seeking fame, was only seeking truth. He constantly asked people for definitions. What is justice? What is courage? What is beauty? People would answer, but Socrates would tear those answers apart. He showed contradictions, brought ignorance to light. This situation made young Plato admire him. He had never seen such a method of thinking before. He even burned the tragedy draft he was writing. He would no longer be a theater writer. Instead, he would become a philosopher. Thus, he joined among the young people gathering around Socrates and was with him for 8 years. Every day he listened, debated, learned. Socrates taught him to seek truth, not to make a political career. He taught him to investigate the reality behind appearances, to defend what was right and not what was popular. Plato learned much from Socrates, but one thing constantly bothered him. Socrates was continuously asking questions, but never giving answers. For example, he would ask, "What is beauty?" People would list beautiful things: a beautiful statue, a beautiful face, a beautiful song. But Socrates would say these are beautiful things, but not beauty itself. So what was beauty itself? Socrates wouldn't answer this either, only saying he didn't know. Young Plato continued carrying this question in his mind. Then, in 399 BC, something terrible happened. Athens put Socrates on trial, and the accusations were utterly ridiculous. Corrupting the youth, disrespecting the gods. Plato was at the trial. He saw everything. His teacher defended himself but didn't apologize. On the contrary, he provoked the jury. He defined himself as a gadfly, the annoying insect that awakens Athens. Finally, the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. Plato was in deep shock. How could the most just, most wise man be condemned to death? What kind of justice was this? During Socrates' last days, Plato was ill, so he couldn't visit. But friends told him everything later. Crito's escape plan, Socrates' rejection of it, the final conversations, the poison cup. Socrates had calmly drunk the cup, said his last words, closed his eyes. Plato was only 28 years old at that time. He had lost the most important person in his life. This death deeply shook Plato, and he began to hate Athens. This city had killed its best man. Democracy wasn't just because the majority could be stupid. 501 people had gathered and condemned the wisest man. Then what was real justice? Plato left Athens carrying this question in his mind. First he went to Megara, and there met with Euclid, another student of Socrates. Together they remembered Socrates, discussed his method. Then he set out south, toward Egypt. He walked along the Nile River, saw the pyramids, listened to the Egyptian priests' new geometry, observed the stars, preserved ancient knowledge. Plato was fascinated by geometry because geometry reached precise, unchanging truths. The sum of the internal angles of a triangle is always 180 degrees. This was unchangeable, indisputable, perfect. Later he went north to Italy. In southern Italy, there were Pythagorean schools. The Pythagoreans had combined mathematics with mysticism. Numbers had hidden meanings. The universe was ordered according to mathematical principles. Plato listened to them and was impressed. Perhaps truth could be found with mathematics. Then he went to Sicily and arrived at the city of Syracuse tyrant. Dionysius invited him to his palace. Plato was excited because perhaps philosophers could influence tyrants, teach them justice, establish an ideal state. He went to the palace, spoke with the tyrant. He talked about justice, virtue, wisdom. But the tyrant wasn't interested. He wanted power, not truth. He argued with Plato and finally attempted to sell him as a slave. Fortunately, a friend paid the ransom and saved him. Plato suffered disillusionment and understood that only talking wasn't enough. Tyrants weren't listening to philosophers. Then what could be done? Perhaps philosophers should be kings, or kings should be philosophers. Because unless power and wisdom united, there could be no justice. In 387 BC, he returned to Athens. He was 40 years old and had matured. For 12 years he had traveled the world, thought, developed his ideas. Now he knew what he had to do. He would establish a school. But this wouldn't be just a school. It would be a research center, a home of thought. He would keep Socrates' ideas alive, develop them, transmit them to new generations. Outside Athens, next to the garden of the mythological hero Academus, he bought a plot of land and gave it the name Academy. He hung a sign on the door, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter," because according to Plato, mathematics taught reasoning. It showed disciplined thinking, how to reach precise conclusions. Thus, the ancestor of modern universities was born. At the Academy, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, philosophy were taught. Plato used Socrates' method in classes. The dialogue method, he asked questions. Students answered. Then everyone debated together. No one memorized, everyone thought. However, Socrates hadn't written, but Plato did write. He was writing dialogues to immortalize his teacher. He made Socrates speak, used his method, kept his spirit alive. In his early dialogues, he wrote Socrates' ideas. In the Apology, he narrated his defense. How he spoke before the jury, didn't apologize, defined himself as a gadfly. In Crito, he narrated the escape offer. How Crito pleaded, how Socrates rejected it and respected the laws. In Phaedo, he narrated his last day, how he spoke with his friends, how he debated the immortality of the soul, how he drank the poison cup. These dialogues were so vivid that when reading them you could hear Socrates. However, over time, Plato began to develop his own ideas. Socrates asked questions, but didn't give answers. Plato, however, sought answers. He remembered the question that had bothered him in his youth. What is beauty itself? Not beautiful things, but beauty. And he had found the answer. Forms. Plato said this: the things we see in this world aren't real, they're only shadows. The real world is elsewhere, in the world of forms. For example, there are many beautiful things in the world. A beautiful flower, a beautiful painting, a beautiful face. But all are imperfect, and over time, wither, deteriorate, disappear. So who gives them beauty? The form of beauty. Perfect, unchanging, eternal beauty. All beautiful things are copies, reflections, shadows of this form. In the same way there is the form of justice, the form of good, the form of truth. There's even the form of table, the form of horse. Everything has a perfect form, and we only see imperfect copies of that form. Geometry is perfect for this reason, because it deals with forms, the perfect circle, the perfect triangle. You cannot draw a perfect circle in the world, but you can imagine it in your mind. To explain this, he wrote the famous allegory of the cave people, are sitting chained in a cave since the day they were born. Behind them a fire burns, and they can see shadows on the cave wall. People pass by, objects are carried, their shadows are projected on the wall. The chained people think these shadows are real, because they haven't seen anything else. They name the shadows, debate which shadow is what thing. Then someone breaks the chains, stands up, turns around. At first, the firelight hurts their eyes and they can't see. But gradually they get used to it. They see the fire, see the objects. They understand that what they were seeing weren't shadows. These were the real objects. Then they find the cave exit and go outside. The sunlight hurts their eyes even more. At first they can't see anything, but gradually they get used to it. First they see reflections in the water, then they see the objects themselves. The trees, mountains, sky. Finally they can look at the sun. They understand this was the real world. The cave was only shadows. Even the fire wasn't true light. It was a weak imitation of the sun. They return to the cave with joy and try to tell the others. But their eyes can no longer adjust to the darkness, and they stumble. The other people laugh at them. They think going outside has damaged their eyes. They don't believe them. They even try to silence them because they're disturbing their shadow world. We are those people in the cave. The things we see are only shadows, copies of the forms. The philosopher is the person who exits the cave. They see the real world, grasp the world of forms. The sun is the form of the good, that which illuminates everything, gives meaning to everything. The philosopher returns and tries to enlighten the people. But people don't listen to them, may even kill them, just as Athens killed Socrates. According to Plato, the soul is immortal. The body dies, but the soul lives. Before entering the body, the soul was in the world of forms. There it saw everything, knew everything, perfect beauty, perfect justice, perfect truth. But upon entering the body, it forgot. Bodily senses blinded it, and it could no longer see the forms. Thus learning is remembering. We're not learning new things. We're only remembering what we forgot. When we see a mathematical theorem, we recognize it because our soul already knew it. When we see a beautiful thing, we're affected because the soul remembers the form of beauty. When we see a just action, we appreciate it because the soul remembers the form of justice. Therefore, education is not giving new knowledge, but reminding. Plato conducted an experiment to prove this idea. He called an uneducated slave boy and asked him geometry questions. The boy had never learned geometry, but Plato asked the right questions, and the boy found the right answers. Here's the proof. The boy remembered the knowledge, didn't learn it, because his soul already knew. Years passed at the academy. Students came, learned, left. Some became famous mathematicians, some astronomers, some philosophers. His brightest student was Aristotle. He had come to the academy at 17 and stayed for 20 years. Plato called him the mind of the academy. Because Aristotle was incredibly intelligent, he read everything, asked everything, understood everything. However, Aristotle didn't agree with Plato on every subject. He didn't accept the theory of forms to him. Reality was here, in the visible world. A separate world of forms was unnecessary, an unprovable assumption. For instance, is there such a thing as the form of horse? There are real horses, we observe them. Why assume another world? This divergence grew over time, but didn't come to light while Plato lived. When he was around 60, Plato was again invited to Sicily. The old tyrant's son, young Dionysius, had ascended to the throne. Plato's former student Dion sent a letter. The young tyrant wanted to learn philosophy. Perhaps this time it would work. Plato hesitated, but finally accepted. Perhaps the philosopher-king idea could finally be realized. He went, but was again disillusioned. The young tyrant showed interest at first, listened to Plato, learned geometry. But then he got bored. Philosophy was difficult, whereas power was more attractive. He felt jealousy between Plato and Dion, and sent Dion into exile. Plato was in danger and escaped with difficulty. A few years later, he was invited a third time. He went a third time and failed a third time. Finally, he understood. Practical politics and philosophy didn't walk together. The philosopher-king idea was beautiful, but very difficult to realize. He returned to the academy and continued teaching. He had already aged, but his mind remained sharp. He continued writing his most famous work, The Republic. Then he wrote The Laws. The Republic described the ideal society, perfect but unreal. The Laws was more practical and offered proposals for a real state. Aging Plato was trying to reconcile idealism with realism. Plato lived to 80 years old and died in 348 BC. According to one version, he died at a wedding feast. Some say he died sleeping. Others say he died writing. But this information isn't definitive. In any case, he had lived a long, productive life. He had taught at the academy for 40 years. He had written more than 30 dialogues. He had immortalized Socrates, developed his own ideas, trained thousands of students. The academy continued for 900 years after him. Yes, exactly 900 years. It continued functioning until the Christian emperor Justinian closed it in 529 AD. This was the longest-lived educational institution in human history. Plato's works weren't lost, and they're all in our hands. This is truly miraculous, because most ancient texts were lost. But Plato's dialogues were copied, preserved, transmitted through generations, because people found them very valuable. Philosopher Whitehead once said, "Western philosophy consists of footnotes to Plato." Although this seems an exaggerated statement, it shows an important truth Plato set philosophy's agenda. What questions should be asked? What is reality? What is knowledge? What is good? What is justice? What is beauty? These questions existed before Plato, but Plato systematized them, deepened them. The theory of forms dominated philosophy for 1,000 years. Medieval Christian thinkers accepted Plato. Augustine combined him with Christianity and interpreted the world of forms as God's mind. In the Renaissance, Plato was rediscovered, and a new academy was founded in Florence. Plato's story isn't just a philosopher's story, it's also a student's story. The story of a student who loved his teacher, lost him, then immortalized him. Socrates didn't write, but Plato wrote. Socrates asked questions, but Plato sought answers. Socrates was practical, but Plato was theoretical. Together, they laid the foundation of philosophy. Plato taught us this. There is a reality behind appearances. This world isn't enough. We must seek ideals. We may not be perfect, but we can imagine perfection. We may not be able to establish the ideal state, but we can think of the ideal state. What is good? What is just? What is beautiful? Asking these questions, seeking their answers, is what makes humans human. Plato taught us to dream, to think, to chase ideals. That's why we still talk about him 2,400 years later. If you enjoy discovering these kinds of inspiring stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share what you think about Plato in the comments. In our next video, we'll tell the story of another person who left their mark on history. See you. Goodbye.